You might choose to do the other side.
Okay.
Let me just clear out.
The other thing, just want to remind you,
Sure.
if there are questions, they're allowed to get here. The other side?
You can introduce here.
Is this his or is yours? Good? Okay. Good afternoon. Afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Gary Reich, Vice President for Programming here at Congregation Agudat Achim. It's always exciting this time of year to see what the Adult Education Committee has put together for us for their annual Scholar in Residence weekend. The programmatic theme that Adult Ed chose for this year is People of the Books, so what could be more on point than to invite a prominent scholar of the Bible to visit us. Benjamin Sommer is professor of Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary and a senior fellow at the Center for Contemporary Jewish Thought at the Hartman Institute. That's a pair of positions that suits well with the description that appeared in Haaretz of Professor Sommer as both a traditionalist and an iconoclast, someone who shatters idols, but also nurtures the Jewish tradition and its applicability today. Those comments were made in connection with his most recent book, Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition. It's a book that Publishers Weekly described as a groundbreaking work. It was awarded the prestigious Goldstein-Goren Prize in Jewish Thought in 2016 and was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. His earlier books also were widely read and received multiple awards. And if I can speak as one of the people who has been attending Rabbi Spitzer's weekly classes on Psalms, and yes, that's a plug, I was especially interested to hear of the forthcoming JPS Bible Commentary series on the Psalms, for which Professor Sommer is the editor, also an author. Professor Sommer is a well-known and sought-after teacher to both rabbinic and lay groups in the United States and in Israel, and I want to thank especially Amy Posner and the entire Adult Education Committee for inviting such a wonderful scholar to teach us this weekend. Professor Sommer's title for this afternoon is What Sort of Book is the Torah, and why is it called the Torah? So, Professor Sommer.
Thank you. Again, it is a pleasure to be here, to be teaching some Torah at Agudat Achim, and to be sharing with you learning having to do with Judaism as a religion of the books and the Jewish people as a people of the books. So I'd like to address the question today in this session, what sort of a book is the Torah? If you stop and think about it, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the Chumash, the Pentateuch, it's a very, very odd sort of book. It's a mixture of many, many different types of genres, many different types of books, and it's fairly unique. There are very few other examples of a book that has within it so many different genres, so many different types of literature. So, for example, if you just go through the Pentateuch and you think about what's the genre of the Pentateuch, it's not an epic poem, it's not like Homer, it's not a drama, it's not exactly a law code because it's got an enormous, although it has a lot of legal material, about 50% of the Torah, in one sense or another, might be considered to be law. Nonetheless, it's not a legal code. It has an enormous amount of narrative material. It's very, very hard to sort of pin down what's the genre of the Torah. And I think that the question of the genre of the Torah, the type of book that it is going to turn out to, by the end of this lecture, I think it'll turn out to say something significant about not just the Torah itself, but the religion of Torah, about Judaism. So I'd like to ask this question, okay, so this combination of legal texts, narrative texts, texts that give directions on how to construct a tent and how to make a certain set of clothing for the priests, a text that has some poetry interspersed throughout it. What does the whole add up to? In order to answer that question, I think it'll be useful to think about the term Torah itself. Already in ancient times, already in the biblical period, the title Torah was applied to this book, to this very, very varied collection of material. And so if we can understand what the word Torah means in biblical Hebrew, I think we'll begin perhaps to understand how the Torah was understood in ancient times by the people who first actually wrote the Torah. So I'd like to, although our bigger question today is what is the Torah? What sort of book is the Torah? I'd like to spend a good amount of time, the majority of our time today, just looking at the word Torah to see, well, what does the word Torah actually refer to? Once we've done that, I think we can come back to thinking about the 5 books of Moses and thinking about essentially what this book really is. So let's just talk first of all about the noun, the Hebrew noun Torah. The Hebrew noun Torah comes from the verb lihorot. So if you'll go on the handout to, somehow the handout for earlier today was stapled on top of the handout for today. So just skip the first page and go to the page that actually says page number 1. At the top it says what sort of book is the Torah and why is Torah its title. If you go to that page, I give you some examples of the verb hora or lihorot, from which the noun Torah is derived. The verb hora, or in the infinitive form lihorot, its primary meaning is actually to shoot something or to throw something. So especially to shoot an arrow. I give you there from 1 Samuel chapter 20 an example of David saying to Jonathan, I'm going to shoot 3 arrows to one side. Actually, Jonathan's speaking to David here, not the other way around. He says, I'm going to shoot an arrow. This is one of several cases in the Bible of this verb meaning to shoot or to throw an arrow. Same thing in 2 Kings. Now, to shoot an arrow then develops to have a secondary meaning of to point to somebody, to point to something, to show something, to send someone in a particular direction. If you think about an arrow in our culture, we use arrows to give directions, right? We might, draw a map for somebody and use arrows. Arrows in our culture too are a symbol of giving somebody direction, because this tends naturally to be the case. The verb lihorot also comes to show somebody something, to point something out. So an example at the bottom of page 1 from Sefer Mishlei, from the third part of the Tanakh, from the book of Proverbs, is the phrase, Koretz be'einav, molel beraglav, moreh be'etzbeotav. It's a reference to a person winking with his eyes, shuffling his feet, and pointing with his finger. You can be moreh in the sense of pointing to something. From that meaning of to show something, to point something, to send somebody guidance, to send somebody in a particular direction, the noun Torah that derives from the verb hora comes to mean guidance. The basic meaning of the Hebrew word Torah is guidance. So and it can be guidance that comes from any of a number of sources. It can be guidance from a human being, or it can be guidance from a god. The first example that I give you there on the top of page 2 of the noun Torah is an example where it means guidance that comes from a human being, specifically in this case from a parent. Shema b'ni musar avicha V'al titosh Torat imecha. Listen, my son, to the discipline of your father, the discipline that comes from your father. Do not reject the guidance or the instruction that comes from your mother. The JPS translation here, which I'm giving you on the left side of the page, translates Torah here as instruction. We could also use the word guidance. That second example also is a father speaking to a son, or a teacher speaking to a student whom he refers to as his son. And there too, although JPS translates this as teaching, it's referring to guidance, instruction, teaching that comes from a human source. Guidance can also come in that third example from Proverbs, from Mishlei chapter 13. Guidance can come from a wise person, a sage. That's what we're getting in that third example. Now, Torah can mean guidance generally. There is a type of guidance or instruction that tells you how to live your life, how to behave, and we can refer to that sort of guidance as a law, as legal guidance. And very, very often in the Tanakh, in the Bible, the word Torah refers to guidance in the sense of a law. That is to say, a particular piece of guidance that you are required to obey and that you might be punished for disobeying. So, for example, in the middle of page 2, I took a verse from the book of Jeremiah that reads, Vayomer Adonai, al ozvam et torati asher natati lifnehem velo shame'u v'koli velo halachu vo. Hashem said to the prophet, said to me, because the Israelites are going to be punished because the Israelites forsook the Torah that I had set before them. They didn't obey me, they didn't follow it, they didn't walk in its way. From the verbs that we're getting in this verse, it's clear that Torah is something that can be obeyed or disobeyed. Thus, we're talking about guidance in the sense of a law. You get the same thing in that next example from the book of Daniel as well. This is some sort of law that comes from, comes from a divine source. The second example also makes clear. And it's something that should be followed. The Hebrew is v'lo shamanu b'kol Adonai Eloheinu lalechet b'torotav. We didn't obey the voice of Hashem our God by walking in His ways or by observing His Torah. Again, the fact that the verbs here are talking about obedience shows that Torah here isn't just guidance in some abstract sense. Torah is referring to a law. Having said that, Torah in the Bible often refers in more specific ways to a particular kind of law. One kind of law, maybe the most frequent, is ritual law. Very, very often in the book of Leviticus, a passage will begin or end by saying, this has been the law of such and such. So at the beginning of Leviticus chapter 2, God says to Moses, command Aaron and his sons as follows, Zot Torat Ha'olah. This is the Torah of the whole offering, or the burnt offering. In other words, what follows are the rules for how to carry out the ritual of a burnt offering, of what's called the olah offering. JPS translates this here with the word ritual because these are the directions for a particular ritual practice. But the word Torah itself doesn't really mean ritual. The word Torah means a law, and this is the law of a particular ritual. And we get that again and again and again in the book of Leviticus, Zot Torat something. This is the law for such and such a ritual, which JPS usually translates just with the word ritual, but a more accurate translation might be, this is the law for a particular ritual, or what follows, or what we've just read, are the directions for a particular ritual. That shows up again and again in Leviticus. I only gave you 4 examples, but there are dozens of examples of Torah, meaning ritual law. Going on to page 4, it becomes clear that Torah can also refer to civil law or criminal law. Amos quotes God as complaining that the Israelites have not obeyed the Torah, and that is why the Israelites are going to be risking punishment. And when the passage in Amos goes on, the items that Amos refers to specifically, or that God, quoted by Amos, refers to specifically, are not matters of ritual law. These are really matters of basic ethics, or of criminal law, or possibly even in some cases of civil law. So from this example in Amos, I think it becomes clear that, yeah, Torah can mean ritual law, but it isn't only ritual law. Torah can refer also to a criminal law, to a ritual law, or really an ethical law, a law about how to treat another human being properly, or what things you shouldn't ever do in treating a human being. Psalm 89 at the top of page 5 shows that Torah can also just refer to law generally without specifying what kind of law we're talking to. The word Torah there, Torati, appears in parallel to the terms mishpatai and chukotai and mitzvotai. So we just get a series of synonyms that mean law, rules, commands, regulations. These are all synonyms that refer to law or rules. Another meaning of the term Torah is that a Torah can be actually a legal ruling. You can go to a legal authority, such as a judge or a priest, and you can ask for a ruling on a particular question that you have. So in this sense, Torah means legal ruling, answer to a legal question, or authoritative answer to a legal question. In later forms of Hebrew or Aramaic, this is really pretty much what we use, what we mean when we use the term psak. The term Torah in biblical Hebrew can mean psak or psak halacha, a legal ruling. So, for example, in the book of Haggai, God says to Haggai, in the middle of page 5 there, Sha'alna et ha-kohanim Torah lemor. Ask the Kohanim, ask the priests for a Torah. JPS translates this as ruling. In kind of typical American Jewish English, we might even say, ask the Kohanim for a psak. Go ask a she'elah, get a tshuva, get a psak halacha from a Kohen. So this is a clear case of Torah meaning a ruling from an authoritative ritual source, from an authority in a matter of ritual law. You get the same meaning, I think, in a very, very famous passage from the book of Isaiah, which is often quoted, though I'm not sure people really always understand what's going on in that passage. This is the passage that you'll find on page 6, the famous passage from Isaiah chapter 2. The same passage also appears in the book of Micah chapter 4, and it's etched into the edge of the United Nations building in New York City. Let's just take a quick look at that passage. In days to come, Isaiah says, the mountain of Hashem's temple shall stand firm above the mountains. It'll be lifted up above other mountains and hills, and tower above the hills. And all nations, I would translate this as, all nations shall flow to it, will flow to it rather than gaze in joy. In other words, nations from around the world, people from various nations, will come to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The verb v'naharu literally means they will flow the way that a river flows. They're going to be flowing from around the world uphill towards the Temple Mount, towards the temple in Jerusalem. And many people shall go and say, come, let us go to the mountain of Hashem, to the house or the temple of the God of Jacob. That way we may be instructed in God's ways. V'yorenu midrachav. Literally, you might translate this a little bit more closely to the Hebrew as, let's go to that mountain so that he will teach us, or he will give us instruction in some of his ways, so that we may walk in God's path. Then we get the famous line that we all know from the Torah service, which we recited just a little while ago, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah u'devar Adonai mirushalayim. For Torah will come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord, or the prophetic word from Jerusalem. So the people are getting a Torah from God, and here we're talking about the nations of the world. Different nations will come to Jerusalem to get Torah from God. And what will be the result of their getting Torah from God? The result will be God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hook. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again learn war, learn how to conduct war. So the different nations around the world will come to the temple in Jerusalem. They'll get a Torah from God, and the result will be that they won't have to go to war. So what sort of Torah are we talking about? What sort of situation are we talking about? I think what Isaiah is trying to say here, and this becomes clear when you compare this passage to a few other passages in the book of Isaiah, what he's imagining here is that in the future there will still be different nations. The Vietnamese will still be the Vietnamese, and the Cambodians will still be the Cambodians, but all the nations of the world will recognize the one God. And because they recognize the one God, when they have conflicts with each other, instead of going to war to solve the conflict, they'll just go to the temple in Jerusalem and they'll receive binding arbitration in whatever dispute they're having. So if there's some argument over the water of the Mekong River, and Cambodia is building a dam and that's going to affect farmers downstream in Vietnam, well, the way the world is now, maybe that might actually lead to a war, but in the future that Isaiah is imagining, no, the Vietnamese and the Cambodians will go to basically what is an international court with a membership or a security council with a membership of one, with a capital O, and an unparalleled ability to enforce compliance. And they'll go to Jerusalem. Somehow God will tell them what the ruling is. Here's what to do with the water of that river. You know, Cambodia can dam it, but they've got to share 40% of the electricity with Vietnam, and they can only, restrict the water flow by so many gallons per minute and so forth. And instead of having a war over it, the Cambodians and the Vietnamese will go back home, and all that money that might have gone towards the Ministry of Defense in both nations can go instead to the Ministry of Agriculture, since nobody will have an army, nobody will have a Ministry of Defense anymore. Well, in that case, when they're going to Jerusalem to get Torah, they're going to Jerusalem, ki mitzion tetzei Torah. They're going to Jerusalem because Torah comes from Zion. Torah there means a legal ruling. It's a psak. It's a ruling from an authoritative legal source that everybody has to follow. So that's another meaning of the word Torah. The Torah is especially associated with scribes and with priests. I have a few different examples of this on page 7. On page 7, several different prophets talk about how Torah is associated with a priest in the same way that counsel or learning is associated with a sage or a wise man, and an oracle, a prophetic oracle, is associated with a prophet. Well, it would make sense that Torah is especially associated with the priests because ritual law is one of the main areas of Torah, so that's a sensible idea. Torah is also a term that can be used in parallel to or as a synonym with terms that mean covenant or contract. You get that in Psalm 19 at the top of page 8. There's a whole list of nouns that are more or less synonymous with each other, and those nouns include edut, pikudim, mitzvah, and Torah. The noun that starts off that whole list is Torah. It's followed by edut. Edut in biblical Hebrew can actually mean covenant or contract or treaty. I spoke earlier today about those Hittite treaties. There are Assyrian treaties that are somewhat different, but to some degree follow the format of some of the Hittite treaties. The word in the Assyrian language for treaty, for these treaties, is actually adeh, which is the Akkadian form, or the Assyrian form, of a word that shows up in another Semitic language, Hebrew, as edut. So edut means not only witness, which some of you might know from other forms of Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew, edut actually can mean a contract or a covenant. So a Torah is also a covenant, is also a set of laws from this set of synonyms we're getting in chapter 19 of the book of Psalms. Okay, so Torah can mean law, it can mean legal ruling, it can be several different kinds of law, it can be a contractual arrangement. For that reason, Torah can also be used to refer to a book that includes any of those things. I'm not going to go into these particular examples at length, but it's interesting to note that, first of all, sometimes in the Bible, Torah refers specifically to a book, and we can identify what book it's talking about. It's clearly talking about the book of Deuteronomy. That is, when the book of Deuteronomy itself or the book of Kings or Joshua refers to Sefer Torat Adonai, the book of God's Torah, or Sefer Torat Moshe, the book of Moses' Torah, or even just Sefer HaTorah, the book of the Torah, when the book of Deuteronomy and also Joshua and Kings refer to that book, and they also refer to some specific piece of content, it's always a law that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. So in some books of the Bible, Sefer HaTorah is a name for specifically what we call today Sefer Devarim. But when we get to later books in the Bible, so this would be on page 10 of the handout, when we get to the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Hayamim, or in English, Divrei Hayamim is Chronicles, when those books refer to Sefer HaTorah or Sefer Torat Moshe, when they refer to a book of Torah and they refer to something specific, they often refer to something simultaneously that is taken from Deuteronomy and from Leviticus, or simultaneously from Deuteronomy and from Exodus. In other words, they're using the reference to the book of the Torah to refer to something that includes not only Deuteronomy, but also the other books that we know from the Torah. In other words, at the end of the biblical period, in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, the word Sefer HaTorah refers to what we mean by Torah, refers to this book, refers to the 5 books of Moses. And that's why I'm saying we can see that already in biblical times, this noun, Torah, was being used to refer specifically to what we call the Torah. A couple of other notes on what this particular noun can mean. We've seen that it can mean guidance broadly, also guidance in the sense of law. It can also refer to guidance in the sense of something that you study, not just a law book, but advice that you want to memorize and think about and contemplate, so that you'll learn how to think better about situations that you're in. So, for example, in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, there's a reference to the book of the Torah, and an angel speaking to Joshua says in verse 8, "Don't let this book of Torah leave your lips, but murmur it night and day so that you may observe faithfully what is written in it." So this is a book that you not only obey, but you study this book. In the ancient world, the way that you studied a book was always by reading it out loud. You murmured a book. Our modern practice, or by modern I mean, I'm a Bible scholar, so when I say modern I mean the last 1,500 years. Like if it's CE, it's modern. If it's over 0. So in the modern world, we tend to read and study silently, but in the ancient world, reading and studying were always done out loud. You would murmur a book. This ancient tradition, of course, is continued in Judaism and in Islam, in the Beit Midrash in Judaism, in the Madrasa in Islam, where it's normal to go into a Beit Midrash and you'll hear people studying whatever they're studying out loud. So a person who's studying the beginning of Masechet Brachot might be sitting there murmuring, that's the normal way of studying, even today in a yeshiva setting, but was the normal way of studying throughout the world in ancient times. So if we're saying of the Torah that it shouldn't leave your lips, that you should murmur it day and night, what we're saying is that this is a book that you'll be studying. It's not just a reference book of laws. It's something that you want to study, to memorize, to think about. So it's also a guidance text in the sense of something that you study. Something maybe even a little bit similar to what, let's say, a philosophical text would become over in Greece. The sort of instruction that you can get from a Torah also includes stories. It's not only guidance in the sense of laws or in the sense of advice, but you can get narratives that are instructive from a Torah. You get that sense in Psalm 78 at the top of page 12. Psalm 78 at the top of page 12 is a psalm that begins as follows: Ha'azina ami torati, hatu oznechem li'imre fi. Listen, my people, or give ear, my people, to my Torah. Turn your ear to what I say. Eftecha v'mashal pi. I'm going to expound a theme. Literally, I'm going to tell you something that you can think through. A mashal is a riddle or an aphorism or a proverb, something that you hear that prompts you to think through it carefully to figure out what the statement really implies. Chidot mini kedem, riddles from ancient times. In other words, information that you can think through in order to learn something important and practical. Asher shamanu v'nedaim v'avotenu siperu lanu. This Torah that I'm giving you, this teaching, it's something that we heard and we came to know it. Our fathers told this to us, or our forefathers narrated this. The verb siper means to tell in the sense of to tell a story, to narrate. So I'm going to learn, the psalmist is saying is, listen to the Torah I'm giving you. This is Torah that comes from what our fathers, from the stories we heard from our forefathers. And the psalm then follows to actually give a history of the nation Israel that focuses on various different episodes in the time of the patriarchs and in the time of Moses and all the way up to the time of David. What follows, in other words, in Psalm 78 is a narrative poem. That's actually somewhat rare. The Bible doesn't usually tell stories in poetic form. The Bible usually tells stories in prose, but Psalm 78 is one of a few cases in which we get a narrative poem, a poem that tells a story, and verse 1 of that narrative poem identifies the poem as a piece of Torah. So you can also get Torah in guidance in narrative fashion. There are some stories that invite you to think about the story and to figure out what sort of guidance you can get from this particular story. So Torah includes not only law, but also narrative. Torah can be associated also with prophets. You get a sense of that in Isaiah chapter 8, where there's instruction that is written down on a scroll. What happens in Isaiah chapter 8 is Isaiah is making a prediction about the future, and the king in Jerusalem, King Achaz, doesn't want to listen to him, and Isaiah wants there to be a record. Listen, I predicted such and such, and he's not listening, so I'd like there to be a record that I actually predicted this was going to happen. So several years from now, when it turns out I'm right, people will realize that I said this was going to happen, I gave this warning, and the king didn't listen. So what he says in the verse that I've given you there, chapter 8, verse 16, is bind up the message, seal the message in a scroll. In other words, Isaiah had one of his disciples write down his prediction about the future. Then he said, okay, roll up that little scroll and seal it. Take some wax, melt the wax, seal the scroll, put a seal on it so that it's obvious that Isaiah, actually, I said this. And years from now, you can break the seal in public. People will realize nobody has tampered with this since it was first created back at such and such a date. You can break the seal, open it, and read it, and you'll see, oh, the prophet Isaiah already had told this story about what was going to happen before the events happened. So interestingly, in the case of Isaiah, it's a narrative, it's a story. When he told it, the events hadn't happened yet, but he was telling a story not about the past, but about the future, and the reason he wanted it sealed up in a scroll was to prove that he had predicted correctly what was going to happen. This idea that narrative can also be included in a Torah shows up not only in Psalm 78 and Isaiah chapter 8, but at the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses says, where the verse tells us that Moses undertook to expound, Leva'er, or be'er is the Hebrew verb, to expound this Torah as follows. And what follows for in the entire speech of Moses that begins there, which goes from chapter 1 up until chapter 4, is all narrative material. There's no legal material in this part of the book of Deuteronomy. The legal material doesn't begin until chapter 12. So when this opening part of the book of Deuteronomy is referred to as being Torah, again, a story, a narrative is referred to as Torah. One final example from the book of Exodus, chapter 13. We're supposed to tell the story of how we got out of Egypt to our children. In fact, we're supposed to encourage our children to be curious about the story. We're supposed to encourage that by performing certain odd rituals. By performing those odd rituals, the children will hopefully ask a question, why are you doing that? And that will allow us to tell the story of how we were liberated from slavery in Egypt. And the story is referred to in verse 9 as a teaching. It's something that the story is something that we're supposed to remember. We're supposed to put reminders of the story on our body. This is what we interpret as being the mitzvah of tefillin. But the passage as a whole shows that the teaching that we're talking about here is a teaching that involves a story. It's not only a law, it's in this particular case, the teaching, the guidance comes from a particular story. Okay, so we've seen a bunch of different uses of the word Torah. To summarize main points here, Torah number 1 is guidance. Torah is something that sends you forward in a straight direction, in the right direction. This guidance can take the form of ritual law, civil law, ethical law. It can also take the form of wisdom that prompts you to think. It can also take the form of a story. So why was the Torah, why were the 5 books of Moses given the title Torah? Well, what's interesting about the 5 books of Moses is that although we're always jumping around between different genres within the 5 books of Moses, we're always getting one of the kinds of Torah that we just saw. The book of Genesis is all narrative. The book of Exodus begins with about 14 chapters of narrative. We get more narrative material in other parts of Exodus, tiny little bit of Leviticus, parts of Numbers, parts of Deuteronomy. So we get Torah in the sense of a story you should think about because it will make clear what direction you should move your life in, how you should live your life, how your community, how your family should live its life. Torah is an appropriate word because we're getting that kind of narrative in much of the Torah. We also get plenty of ritual law throughout the latter part of the book of Exodus, throughout the book of Leviticus, and then parts of Numbers. Plus we get civil and criminal law in the book of Exodus, in parts of the book of Leviticus, little bits of Numbers, various parts of the middle part of the book of Deuteronomy. We also get directions of other kinds, for example, directions for how to build the Mishkan, how to build the tabernacle, which we're about to begin reading next week, in the last part of the book of Exodus. We get directions for how to build things, how to make things. So we're getting Torah in a number of different ways, but we're always getting one of these kinds of Torah. The Torah that we're getting in the 5 books of Moses is a mixture of narrative guidance and legal guidance. Then we could subdivide it into various kinds of legal guidance, but it's a mixture of narrative and legal guidance. The reason I'm going at such great length to make this point is that very often the word Torah gets translated into English as law, or into German as Gesetz, or going all the way back to the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Bible that was carried out by the Jewish community in Egypt in the 2nd century, parts of the 3rd century BCE. There, the word Torah is usually translated as nomos, which is a standard term for law. And so people think of Torah as law, maybe law with a capital L, but in fact, the actual 5 books of Moses, about 50% of the 5 books of Moses is narrative material, and when you look at the word Torah as it appears in biblical Hebrew, it refers to many different kinds of guidance, including explicitly in several of the verses that we just looked at, including guidance that comes in the form of narrative. So the 5 books of Moses are Torah, not simply in the sense of law, they're guidance that comes in legal and in narrative format. It's a combination of law and narrative. And we're making a bit of a mistake if we think of the Torah only as being a law code or a law book. Rashi actually makes this point in his very, very first comment on the Torah in his commentary to the book of Genesis. So on the last page of the handout, I've given you what is literally the first comment from Rashi. So let's take a look at that passage. And I'm actually less interested in the specific comment he's making here than in how is he conceiving the Torah. As he begins his commentary on the Torah, what is he thinking the Torah fundamentally is? He writes, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Lo haya tzarich lahatchil et haTorah ela mehachodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. A rabbi named Isaac said, one would have thought that the Torah should have started with Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, which reads, this month is the beginning of the months for you. Now, Exodus chapter 12 is the first legal passage in the Torah. It's the first time we get a law in the Torah. We're in the 63rd chapter of the Torah, and for the first time we get an actual, in this case, a ritual law that tells us how to observe Passover. And so the comment of Rabbi Isaac says, you might have thought that the Torah should have started at chapter 12, because if the Torah is law, then, why doesn't it start there? Why do we have 62 chapters of narrative material preceding the law? He goes on to say, he says, of Exodus 12, he says, Shehi mitzvah rishonah shenitztavu ba'Yisrael, that Exodus 12 contains the first mitzvah, the first commandment that was enjoined upon the Israelites. Uma ta'am patach be'vereshit. So what's the reason that the Torah begins with Bereshit bara Elohim, within the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth? Why does it begin with a story, specifically the story of the creation of the world? And he goes on to say, it's to make the point that God created the whole world, and therefore God is allowed to assign parts of the world to different peoples, and God assigned the land of Israel to the people Israel. So before we get to law, we need to have some narratives that tell us crucial information about why God has the right to enjoin laws upon the nation Israel, to tell the nation Israel where they should live, tell them how they should live. God has that right because, first of all, God created the world, also because God created the Jewish people, or chose the Jewish people. When we get to the book of Exodus, we find out that God liberated the Jewish people, and therefore we owe God loyalty. We are required to obey those laws. So Rashi is saying here, and Rabbi Isaac is saying here, that you might have thought that the Torah is only a law book, but if you're thinking that, you're misunderstanding the Torah. The Torah doesn't just present laws, it contextualizes laws. It tells us that the laws are supposed to be obeyed in a certain way and for certain reasons. The stories that we find in the Torah provide that information about the laws that we're supposed to be obeying. That idea of a book that isn't only a law book but combines law and narrative ends up becoming, I think, absolutely crucial to the Jewish people, to the Jewish religion, to all of Jewish literary and religious culture. That becomes maybe a little more obvious if we start using the Hebrew terms. A book that combines law and narrative, in Hebrew we would say what? It combines what with what? What would be the terms that go together for talking about law and narrative that often show up together in Jewish culture? Anyone? Halacha and Agadah. Halacha refers to law, the way that you have to behave, the path that you walk. Agadah, from the verb lahagid, to tell, to narrate, refers to narrative. And Agadah is used as a term for narrative in the narrow sense of actually telling a story, but also really for just thinking about something at a more sort of philosophical or theological level as opposed to talking about strict law. And if you think about it, classical Jew, although it's odd that we find in the Torah that we're jumping back and forth between law and narrative, you don't get books like that in the world so often. In Jewish culture, we actually often do get books that contain both law and narrative and jump back and forth between the law and the narrative. What would be some other examples of this? Of a classical Jewish text or a classical type of Jewish text where you get law and narrative, you jump back and forth, or you start with a narrative and that brings you to a law. Where do you see this elsewhere in Jewish culture? The Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, they are also, like the Torah, books that jump back and forth over and over and over again between law and narrative. I mean, the Torah begins with a lot of narrative. Only at Exodus chapter 12 does it go into law, and then from then on it combines, constantly going back and forth between law and narrative. The Talmud begins with a legal question, starting at what time do we recite, or should we or can we recite the evening Shema. But before that first paragraph is over, it actually tells us a story about a particular rabbi and his sons, and from what the rabbi told his sons, we can learn something important about this law, about when you're supposed to recite the evening Shema prayer. And then as you go on, it's constantly going back and forth, especially in the Gemara. That's the case where the first part of the Talmud, the Mishnah, already is going back and forth between law and narrative. When you get to the second and longer part of the Torah, of the Talmud, you're constantly going back and forth between law and narrative. The Talmud really is the central book, especially on a practical level, of the Jewish religion, and like the 5 books of Moses, it is both a work of law and of narrative. I think a lot of people in yeshiva settings who study the Talmud have a tendency to skip the narrative stuff because that's not important. And in doing so, they're really being very disloyal to the actual Talmud and really to the 5 books of Moses. A Jewish way of studying involves always looking at both law and narrative. Any other examples you can think of literature or a type of literature that combines law with narrative, or examples of such a book? Let me ask a question. Is a law code this kind of a book, the Shulchan Aruch or the Mishnah Torah? In fact, actually, let me even step back a moment. Let me suggest that we could actually define a Jewish genre, a type of Jewish literature, as the genre Torah. And I would suggest, and I'm following a number of scholars here, especially Professor David Weiss Halivni, Zichrono Livracha, I would suggest that the genre Torah is by definition a combination of law and narrative, and even more specifically, a combination of law and narrative in which the narrative comes to justify the law or contextualize the law, and in which the law shows up only within this narrative context, only with the justification of that context. Professor Alivni, a very, very famous Talmud, one of the greatest Talmud scholars of the 20th century, he wrote a book with the title Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, The Jewish Predilection for Justified Law. In this book, he points out that in Judaism, although people think of Judaism as a religion of law, it's really a religion of law and narrative, because the law is always contextualized and justified by a story or by some sort of extra-legal conceptual thinking. He points out that there have been cases in Jewish history of books that were primarily just law, but those books were sort of controversial, and they ended up being corrected by supplements that brought the narrative back in. So a classic example would be the Mishnah. Though the Mishnah begins in that first paragraph with a combination of law and narrative, the Mishnah is mostly just legal passages, and it doesn't justify its law. It just kind of lays down what the law is. It doesn't give us justified law. But the Talmuds correct that absence, or they fill that absence. The Talmud constantly asks the question, Minalan, how do we know this? what's the justification for the law that the Mishnah just laid down? And the justification for that law often involves going back to the Bible and engaging in midrash, doing midrashic interpretation of a verse from the Bible. It often involves digressing into all sorts of different narratives about the rabbis, narratives about the biblical figures, and those narratives provide context and justification for the laws found in the Mishnah. At some level, you can almost think of, if Torah is the prototypical Jewish genre, then the Mishnah is, from the Jewish point of view, a little bit of a category error. And the Talmuds immediately correct that error. As soon as the Mishnah came into existence, the rabbis started engaging in the conversations that ultimately produced the two Talmuds, and those conversations were bringing the justification back in. So thinking about other law codes, Maimonides' law code, the Mishnah Torah, also known as the Yad HaChazakah, in this sense, is Maimonides' law code an example of Torah or not? You're suggesting not. How come? There's very little narrative. Once you get past the first book, Sefer HaMadah, and you get into all the rest of the books of Maimonides' law code, it's pure law. After the first book, it's pure law. It doesn't go back and forth. On the other hand, I think you might say, well, Sefer HaMadah, however, is not a law book. Sefer HaMadah is a philosophical work that attempts to justify the entire legal system by referring that system to a commanding God, and it asks the question, who or what is this commanding God? So that whole first part of Maimonides' code is in its entirety a philosophical work, not a legal work. So broadly speaking, we could say that it begins with some pretty serious Agadah. Also, if you've studied the Mishnah Torah, the Mishnah Torah begins actually, before it even has Sefer HaMadah, there's Sefer HaMitzvot, the listing of the 613 commandments with reference to their specific verses, back from which each commandment is derived. And Sefer HaMitzvot begins literally with a narrative. It begins with a story of how God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. Moses taught it to the elders, to the tribal elders, also to Aaron. Aaron taught it to his sons. Joshua taught it to other tribal elders. And then generation after generation, the Torah went from God at Sinai to Moses, to various Israelites, to the next generation, to the next one. And it's actually a historical narrative that brings the law all the way from Sinai to Spain, to himself, having grown up in Spain. So so Maimonides' code actually does begin with narrative, even narrative in the narrow literal sense. It tells a historical story of how the Torah made it from Sinai to Spain and thus into the Mishnah Torah. So in a way, I think that you could say, although Maimonides doesn't jump back and forth, Maimonides' Mishnah Torah really is a work of law, is a work of Torah, because it contains not only law, it does begin with Agadah. It doesn't just contain halakha. What about the Shulchan Aruch, the most famous code of Jewish law? Well, by this definition, no. Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, the classic code of Jewish law, it really is just a code of law. And I would argue that from a genre point of view, it's not a work of Torah, because it's only law, it's only halakha, it doesn't have agadah. And it's interesting, therefore, to note, for one thing, that it was a controversial book, and even to some degree is a controversial book. There are many people who think that learning Jewish law from a law code is not a good way to learn Jewish law. Learning Jewish law shouldn't just be about memorizing. It should be about learning context and learning how the law applies in different situations. From that point of view, the best way to learn Jewish law is by reading a different genre, the genre of shutim, or she'elot u'tshuvot, questions and answers. There is a famous literature of she'elot u'tshuvot. People going back to the early Middle Ages have asked their rabbis questions. The rabbi, as an authority in law, answers the question. In most cases, the answer is just given orally and isn't preserved, but in certain cases, if the case is interesting enough, the rabbi will actually write it up, and these have been preserved and collected. Nowadays, you can go to the library and read lots and lots of Sheilot Utshuvot, or you can get the Dafka CD-ROM and have, tens of centuries of Sheilot and Tshuvot available to you that you can search. A she'ela u'tshuva, a question and an answer, that really is a work of Torah, because the she'ela always tells a story. It may be quite simple. I'm sure there are people in the room who have contacted Rafi or contacted the previous rabbi here to ask a question. It may be a very, very simple story. It may be, I opened the meat drawer and I saw a milk knife in the meat drawer. What should I do? That's a story. That's a narrative. It's not going to win the Pulitzer for short fiction, but it is a narrative. A she'ela and tshuva, a shoot, always begins with a short narrative that is followed by a law. A response, okay, well, in this particular situation, actually the rabbi might then elicit more information. Do you know when you last used that particular knife? Was it hot when you used it? Have 24 hours passed? The rabbi might want to get more narrative information. Having gotten that narrative information, the rabbi will then be in a position to answer the question. And it might be, you have to kosher the knife. It might be, no, there's no problem, depending on the information that the rabbi was able to elicit. Shutim are really works of Torah. And a lot of people think that the way to become a real authority in Torah isn't just to memorize stuff from the Shulchan Aruch, but to read Shutim. For example, Ovadia Yosef was considered one of the great legal decisors, not just of the 20th century, but really of the last several centuries of Jewish history. He really was a great scholar, a great authority in Torah before he moved into politics. He was a great authority because he had simply read an enormous number of shutim before there were CD-ROMs, and he just had this extraordinary encyclopedic knowledge of the entire literature of shutim, and he could just remember, this situation is similar to something that happened in Morocco in the 15th century, and somebody wrote about it, and that's what allowed him to be such an extraordinary legal decisor. It wasn't just that he had memorized a lot of the Shulchan Aruch, he thought about context, and he just had this phenomenal memory for centuries and centuries and centuries of stories that involve similar or analogous legal contexts. Jewish law, in other words, is law always combined with a narrative. And I think that when we think of Judaism as being just a religion of law, we're doing Judaism something of an injustice. We're doing Judaism an injustice because our law is always combined with a story, and how the law applies in different situations is going to often differ on various types of circumstances. This idea that Torah is about law and narrative, halacha and agadah, binding guidance combined with information about ideas, information about situation, that tells us, I think, about a more authentic, more historically authentic Judaism. In the modern era, I think that a tragedy that's happened to our people is that Jews have tended to divide into law Jews and narrative Jews, halacha Jews and agadah Jews. But a healthy Judaism is a Judaism that has both halacha and agadah. Especially further to the right, there are many people who have become kind of pure halacha Jews. Further to the left, there are people who have become pure agadah Jews. And both of those are forms of Judaism that are disloyal to Judaism, are disloyal to Torah as it has existed from the very, very beginning. I'll end with this one last note that kind of brings us back to my Dvar Torah earlier today. So for this, it's actually helpful that an extra sheet was attached. I mentioned that it's not that characteristic of world literature that you get texts that combine narrative and law the way that we Jews very frequently do in the 5 books of Moses, in the Talmuds, and in the responsa literature, and arguably even in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. There are some cases from the ancient world of documents that combine law and narrative. I'd like to suggest that I talked about one of them earlier today. Those Hittite treaties that I talked about in my Dvar Torah before Musaf, they actually always begin with a short narrative. First, actually, they always begin with the self-identification of the emperor, but after that, at some point in the treaty, usually at the beginning, there will be a short narrative, as I explained earlier, a short narrative that explains why the vassal king owes loyalty to the suzerain, to the Hittite emperor. That is, it might be, when the Assyrians invaded your country, I sent my army to go rescue you, and I restored you to your throne. That narrative explains why you owe me loyalty, and then the rest of the treaty contains stipulations that the vassal king has to obey. I think that this Hittite form, this Hittite treaty form, had disappeared with the collapse of the Hittite empire around 1200 BCE. The Hittite empire collapses just as the Israelites are appearing in the highlands of the land of Canaan and are beginning to settle down in the land of Canaan. In other words, really just at the time when the Israelites are forming as a nation. And by the time the Israelites had kingdoms, let's say 1000 BCE, the Hittite Empire was already defunct. And by the time the Israelites had treaty relationships with an empire, that would be the 8th century BCE when they had treaty relationships with the Assyrians. The Assyrians used a modified contract form. They didn't use the exact form that the Hittites used. But in the Torah, again and again, in Sefer Devarim, in Sefers Shmot and Vayikra, that is in Deuteronomy, also together in Exodus and Leviticus, in Joshua chapter 24, in different parts of the Bible, when this treaty format shows up, it's always the older Hittite treaty format that is showing up, not the later Assyrian format. The reason that that's interesting is it shows that the Israelites didn't get the idea of this metaphor for their relationship with God from the Assyrians. They weren't taking it in the 8th century from the Assyrians when they actually became subject to Assyrian imperialism. They must have gotten this Hittite idea much, much earlier, at the very, very beginning of the existence of the Israelite nation, which means that from the very inception of the Jewish people's existence, this treaty idea that combines law and narrative was already part of our culture. The truth is, it doesn't get written down, we modern Bible scholars think, until later on. It gets written down into various priestly, Levitical, Deuteronomic texts, probably starting in the 9th, the 8th, the 7th centuries. And it doesn't even come together into the form of the Torah that we have, probably until about the late 6th or early 5th century. But even before, but at that point in time, they weren't getting this idea from the Assyrians. This is an idea that they have to have received from their ancient Israelite ancestors at the very beginning, from the very beginning of Israelite culture in about the 12th century. Torah, in the sense of this combination of law and narrative, Torah in the sense of a law, a binding law that is contextualized and justified by a story, that was part of the Jewish people's story before we even were the people of the book, before we actually had the book in the sense that we have it now, probably even before we had written texts, but back when we had oral traditions, this was already part of Judaism. So when I'm saying that an authentic, healthy Judaism combines law and narrative, and that it's something of a tragedy that among modern Jews, we tend to have the Halacha Jews and we tend to have the Agudat Jews, I'm saying that that combining them is authentic because it goes back literally to the very, very beginnings of the Jewish people. And so this combination of law and narrative that is so characteristic of the noun Torah and of the book Torah, that combination really is, if anything is, it is one of the elements of the very essence of Judaism. So I'll go for that long, and I'd love to hear questions or comments. Toda rabah, Shabbat Shalom. Mm-hmm.
Have there been any scholarly discourses on the question of when and why God Emperor ceased to be an active partner in the administration of the world?
So the question is, have there been any scholarly discourse on the question of why God, as the emperor, ceases to be an active partner in creating Torah? I guess, first of all, certainly there have been. I mean, really, that's really more of a theological question, something that Jewish thinkers, Jewish theologians, Jewish philosophers deal with. And I guess I would sort of, first of all, wonder, is it necessarily the case that God has ceased to be an active partner? We might say rather that God has ceased to be an obvious partner, but I'm not necessarily sure that we have to say that God is no longer a partner. In one strand of Jewish thinking, there is the idea of Kol Gadol V'lo Yasaf, I'm quoting from the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4 there, which literally should be translated as God spoke at Sinai with a great voice that did not continue. In other words, God spoke to us once and that was the end of it. But in Jewish culture, that verse is often understood differently. It's often understood, it's translated, for example, by Targum Onkelos as Kal Rav de la, what is it, de la, I'm forgetting the exact Aramaic, but it's translated as a great voice that never ceased. De la Fasak, Kal Rav de la Fasak, a great voice that never ceased. And in that particular strand of Jewish thinking, which you can see in parts of rabbinic literature, which goes on into Jewish mysticism in the Middle Ages and into Chassidut in the early modern period, you do get the idea that, well, somehow or another, although God no longer speaks to us through prophecy, God is still communicating in subtle ways with the Jewish people through the work of interpreters. There is an idea that the role of the rabbinic interpreter, the role of the sage, takes the place of the role of the prophet and overlaps in some way with the role of the prophet. So I'm not 100% sure that we would all necessarily agree that that active presence of God has ceased. Maybe we should say that the obvious presence of God has ceased with the end of prophecy at the end of the biblical period. But there certainly is a side, in modern Jewish thought, especially associated with Abraham Joshua Heschel, a side of Jewish thought that says that God's giving us more space to say our part, but that doesn't mean that God is inactive. It may be that God remains active in a less obvious way. Other questions back there? Mm-hmm.
What did God actually give to Moses on Mount Sinai?
What actually? It's a great question. Someone should write a book about that. And many people have. That would be the subject of a whole series of classes. Other people have asked me that question, and I answered it by writing a book, the book Revelation and Authority. There are many different answers to that question. One particular Jewish answer is that, well, the actual words found in the 5 books of Moses are what God gave, plus a whole series of oral teachings that then were passed on, probably partially forgotten, partially supplemented, and they eventually become the Mishnah. But there's also a way of thinking that says that God gave the Jewish people a nonverbal command. God communicated to the Jewish people something to the effect of, as Jews, to express your love of me, to express your loyalty towards me, you should. And we've been filling in the verbs ever since then. The specific commandments that come out of the event at Mount Sinai are actually authored by the Jewish people in response to God's command, God's demand that we become part of a contractual legal relationship with Him. But the actual terms of the contract, perhaps many of them we ourselves write and continue to write through the ages. That's a way of thinking associated in modern Jewish thought with the great philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, with Abraham Joshua Heschel, with Louis Jacobs. But there are respects in which it does have much, much earlier forebears in Jewish thought. I think if you read the Guide of the Perplexed very carefully, you can see that Maimonides thinks that God gave us a nonverbal command and that Moses, a human being, wrote the actual laws. There are rabbinic texts, I think, that imply that. In my book, Revelation and Authority, I try to show that some of the biblical texts have that model of revelation. The book of Deuteronomy has the more verbal model of revelation, and within the Torah itself, there's a tension between those two different models. That's a real al regel achat, on one foot, answer to the question that didn't do justice to the question, but literally there are a number of books on that topic, one of which I happen to have written. Yes, Rafi.
Would you describe the Constitution of the United States as Torah, and can you talk a little bit about examples of Torah that are not in the Jewish canon, but are in sort of a broader approach, and are they all like derivative of our Torah, or did other peoples come up, the Hittites obviously, like we're derivative of them ultimately, but like did other peoples also develop this relationship between, to use Cover's terminology, nomos and narrative?
Yeah. So the question is a two-part question. Is the United States Constitution an example of Torah in the sense of a combination of Agadah and Halacha? And are there other examples outside of Jewish culture besides the Hittite example? So first of all, regarding the U.S. Constitution, I would say that if we can define Maimonides' Mishneh Torah as an example of the Torah genre, then I think we could describe the Constitution as well, because the Constitution, like Maimonides, begins with a brief narrative before it gets to all the law. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, it tells a story of what the American people decided to do. And insofar as that story, it's about an event, a decision that the American people made, and it's about principles, like what the union is supposed to promote in order to promote the general welfare and so forth. It's dealing, that opening paragraph, that opening paragraph, the preamble, is dealing with Agadah. It's dealing with broad thoughts, not with specific laws. So Maimonides, Mishneh Torah, the American Constitution, they don't jump back and forth between Agadah and Halacha the way that the five books of Moses do, the way that the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud do, but they do start with Agadah and then go to Halacha. So I would say that it depends on how you define things. If jumping back and forth is part of the definition, then neither the Mishneh Torah nor the Constitution would quite be Torah. But if you don't have the jumping back and forth, then I would say that, yeah, this is an example of Torah.
How about the Mishneh Torah read with the Kesef Mishnah and the other, let's say, Kelim, by the
Yes. Maimonides tried to write a pure, straightforward legal document without justification, and Jewish culture did not accept that. The version of the Mishneh Torah that became canon for Jews contains all these commentaries that bring in what Maimonides deliberately left out. That's an important point. Do we see this elsewhere? I'm not a student of all human cultures, so I honestly can't say. I do think that it's quite distinctive. It's rare. We get it in the ancient Near East with the Hittites. We can also see it in the ancient Near East with the law code of Hammurabi, which is even older than the Hittites. It's possible that the Hittites got this idea from Babylonia. Hammurabi was the king of Babylonia. There's reason to think they got the idea from an old Babylonian legal form. But I'm not sure of anybody else picking it up the way that we picked it up. The Assyrians, when they picked up the treaty form, they left out a number of parts of the treaty form, including the historical prologue. And so we in the ancient Near East, we were the only people, past about 1000 BCE or past 1200 BCE that pick up this format, and then we preserve it literally down to the current day. That doesn't mean that somebody else didn't come up with this separately in East Asia or somewhere in the Americas that we don't know about. I do wonder about Zoroastrian culture. There is a Persian collection of law and legal reasoning that has been compared a great deal to the Talmud by great Talmud scholars. Richard Kalman from JTS has worked on this. Yaakov Elman, Zichrono Livracha, from Yeshiva University, wrote a ton about this. There's somebody actually near here at Bard who writes on this topic. I'm forgetting his name, but that can't be that far from here. The person who has the Jack Neusner Chair in Jewish Studies at Bard writes on this topic. So the Babylonian Talmud and this Zoroastrian collection are very similar in some ways, but I don't know if that one, it has a lot of legal reasoning. I don't know if it includes the narrative material. It's a simple question. I could ask Richard when I go back to JTS, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. I should find that out. So I don't think that we're unique in having this combination, but we are distinctive. It's something that's unusual about Jewish culture compared to other cultures, and I would argue it's really, really central to Jewish culture, and we lose it at our peril. Is it really a legal section, or is it more of an ethical, philosophical section? Yeah, I mean, getting narratives that slip into ethical discussion, that's more common. But like real legal discussions of like, and then you'll have to pay 3 times, unless this is the circumstance. In that case, you have to pay a fine that's 2 times the original amount. I don't know that we get that in the Bhagavad Gita. I don't think we get that. I mean, there are the laws of Manu in ancient Sanskrit, but that's just laws. That doesn't, that doesn't have the narrative element. Mm-hmm. Is what? Oh, interesting. A patent.
I am so-and-so, I invented this stuff, it's assigned here, patent has this term, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the first part of the specification is, hey, there's this great problem out there that no one's been able to solve, and then you tell a story of, hey, look, here's our solution to solve the problem.
Oh, interesting.
And then
Mm-hmm.
finally what happens, and this is the legally enforceable part of the patent, right? These are the set of claims, right? What we claim is, and we invented a widget that has this characteristics, and that's actually the part that's legally enforceable. Anything you say in the spec doesn't matter legally. I mean, it has to support your claim. What would really get you in trouble if you violate, or what causes you to have to pay a fine, is if you go and you do something in the claims that somebody's already claimed, and you owe them money, and there's damage, and there's a set of
Oh,
damages.
interesting.
And
What?
that's the structure of every single patent. There's a frontispiece that tells you who everybody is and how long the patent, and how long the patent's good for, followed by basically a narrative section that tells you about the problem and how it's solved, followed by a set of
Interesting. When did patents in this format, more or less, when did this originate? When did Westerners or anyone else in the world begin having patents? Do you happen to know? Italy in the 1400s.
Worth doing a little research on that. That's fascinating.
Fascinating. Gotcha. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Italy 1400s. Toda. Maybe one last question, then we should probably let people go. Mm-hmm.
If you were to go to a publicist, what would you call the Torah? If you wanted to sell it now on Amazon, right, at Barnes & Noble, would you call it Torah? Would that be the title?
I mean, if you were speaking biblical Hebrew, Torah is exactly the right word. Because all those different meanings that I went through in the first, 11 pages or so of the handout, they all contribute something to that title. And an ancient Israelite who spoke biblical Hebrew, he hears the word Torah, any of those verses or any of the meanings found in those verses might potentially be reverberating in that person's head. In modern language, I'm not sure. I mean, the point I was trying to make in the first 45 minutes was precisely that the Hebrew term, the biblical Hebrew term Torah, implies all of this. And if we're just thinking of it as meaning law, we're losing something very, very important.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Sommer. Before we leave, I just wanted to remind everyone that you have one more opportunity to hear Dr. Sommer, and that's tomorrow morning at the Men's Club breakfast. If you have already registered for breakfast, then you know what to do. If you have not, you're still welcome to come after the breakfast for the talk, which I think begins at 10:15. Very good.
Thanks
once again.
Shabbat shalom.